The day of the will reading was overcast, heavy with that particular kind of stillness that follows a funeral. I sat alone in the hallway outside Mr. Conrad's office, waiting to be called in. The air smelled like old paper and varnished wood, the kind of scent that stuck to your clothes and made you feel smaller somehow. I was holding a folder, empty except for a list of questions I had written the night before. I had expected confusion, maybe tension, but not dread. Not this kind of dread. The door creaked open and his assistant gave me a tight nod. "You can come in now." Inside, the room was dim, curtains drawn, a long table set up like a war council. My Aunt Margaret was already seated, perfectly styled in her widow black dress, though she hadn't been married in years. Her two sons, Travis and Blake, were on either side of her, both in tailored suits and smug expressions. My stepmother Lorraine, my father's second wife, sat with one leg crossed over the other, arms folded tightly, eyes scanning her phone until the last moment. They didn't acknowledge me when I entered. Not one of them. I took the only empty seat left, furthest from Mr. Conrad, and set the folder on the table. My fingers were cold, but I kept my back straight. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of looking small. Mr. Conrad, a tall, thin man with a voice like sandpaper, cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I know this has been a difficult week." No one responded. The silence was thick. He continued. "Per the instructions left in Mr. William Layton's revised will, dated 2 months prior to his passing, the following allocations will be made." I stopped breathing. "Revised?" He began to read. "To Aunt Margaret, the family estate and the vineyard business in full. To Travis and Blake, all investment accounts and controlling interest in the family's holdings. To Lorraine, the vacation home in Vermont and remaining insurance proceeds. To me, Olivia, his only daughter. Nothing." I didn't hear the rest. The words were still echoing. Nothing. My breath was tight in my throat. I waited for someone to speak up, to correct the mistake, to say there had been an error. But no one did. My aunt smiled faintly. Travis leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head like a man who had won. Lorraine looked pleased, like she had expected it. I looked at Mr. Conrad. "This must be wrong," I said. My voice came out even, but my heart was pounding. This isn't what he told me." "I'm afraid it's all in order," he said. The will was updated, notarized, and filed. Everything was signed. I swallowed hard. He wasn't well. He was heavily medicated. How could he? "The doctor's note at the time confirmed mental capacity," he cut in. "The court already accepted the document." It felt like the floor shifted beneath me. I gripped the edge of the table. I had been with my father through his illness. I'd flown back and forth from college. I'd spent nights at his bedside. He told me everything he built was for me. He said it over and over again, even when he was too weak to walk. But he hadn't signed that version of the will. Not in his right mind. They had taken advantage of him. Taken advantage of me being away. And now they were sitting across from me, wearing smug faces and hiding their victory behind black dresses and fake grief. I stood slowly, closing my empty folder. "Thank you for your time," I said. Mr. Conrad gave me a sympathetic look, but he didn't stop me. I walked out of the room without looking back. They thought they'd won. They thought I'd walk away ashamed and broken. But they didn't know what I had already suspected. They didn't know I was going to take everything back. And when I did, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be thorough. Relentless. And with interest. The days that followed felt like I was floating through someone else's life. I returned to the apartment I had rented near the vineyard. Small, modest, a short drive from the estate house where I had grown up. That house was now officially Margaret's. She hadn't wasted any time moving in. I drove past it once just to see. Her car was parked out front. The porch light was on. My father's name had already been removed from the mailbox. It was as if I had never existed. What haunted me most wasn't the money or even the property. It was the betrayal. My father and I had been close. I wasn't naive. I knew he had his flaws, but he always made it clear I was his priority. He used to say, "I built this for you, Olivia. Everything here will be yours." So how had that promise vanished? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not just morally wrong, but legally. The will had been updated only 2 months before he died, during the period when his health was deteriorating fast. He'd barely been coherent in those final weeks. I remembered how he struggled to sign basic paperwork. How the nurses adjusted his medication almost daily. How even the simplest conversations wore him out. So how had he been well enough to meet with lawyers, sign legal documents, and execute a full estate transfer? He hadn't. I began to dig. The first thing I did was call the hospital where he'd spent his final weeks. I requested access to his medical files, citing my relationship as his daughter. The process was slow, full of red tape, but I submitted the paperwork and waited. While I waited, I began researching estate law. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had a good head for structure and detail. I found articles on contested wills, undue influence, mental competency, witness testimony, and forged signatures. It was a dark and winding path, but one thing became clear very quickly. If I could prove that my father had been medically unfit when he signed that revised will, the entire thing could be voided. That would be the key. I made a list: names, dates, people who had been involved. First, the lawyer who prepared the updated will. His name was Harold Finch, and he had once worked with my father during a minor property acquisition. Not their usual attorney, not the family's longtime legal counsel. Why had he been involved? Second, the notary who had verified the signature. A woman named Nancy Dole. I didn't recognize her name. Third, the two witnesses listed on the legal document. Supposedly longtime friends of the family, both names sounded vaguely familiar, more like associates of my aunt's than my father's. I was starting to see the outline of something much uglier than favoritism. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup. And my aunt, who had been sniffing around the business ever since my father bought out her late husband's share years ago, had finally made her move. She had help. But so did I. I remembered Charles. My father's old business partner. He had stepped back years ago after a falling out with the family, but he always stayed in touch with me. Birthday calls. Graduation gifts. An invitation to lunch once a year. He was sharp, old school, but fair. Most importantly, he never liked Margaret. I called him that night. "Olivia," he said, surprised. "I heard what happened." I was shocked. "No, you weren't," I replied. "You knew how they were. You knew this could happen." He paused. "I didn't think they'd go that far." "They did." I told him everything. From the reading of the will to the signatures I was starting to question. He listened quietly, asking questions now and then. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, "Come to my office tomorrow. 10 a.m. Bring everything you have." That was the first time I felt something other than helplessness. It was resolve. They had tried to erase me from my own bloodline. But they forgot something essential. I was my father's daughter. And they had underestimated what that meant. Charles's office hadn't changed in over a decade. Same heavy wooden desk, same floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, same wall clock that ticked with quiet authority. When I walked in that morning, it felt like stepping back into a time when things made sense. When my father and Charles used to sit here side by side, planning the future of the vineyard they built together. Charles stood to greet me. He looked older now, but still carried himself like a man who was never caught off guard. His handshake was firm, his gaze steady. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Let's get to work." I pulled out a folder and laid everything I had gathered on the table. The will, the notarization document, copies of the witness signatures, a printout of my father's medication schedule from the final month of his life, one I had pieced together from notes and old texts with his nurse. Charles examined each page carefully, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. "When did your father sign this updated will?" he asked. "Exactly 6 weeks before he passed." He frowned. "And at that time he was already on hospice care?" "Yes." He was barely speaking. Charles leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "That's your angle. Mental capacity. If we can prove he was not of sound mind." "The will is invalid," I finished. He nodded. "But we'll need more than just your word." "I know. That's why I started a list." I opened my notebook and showed him. Names of hospital staff, the nurse who was with him most frequently, the original attorney who'd handled his estate for years before suddenly being replaced. I had even managed to pull a few social media profiles for the witnesses listed on the revised will. One of them had posted a photo 2 hours before the signing, from a city 2 states away. Charles chuckled darkly when he saw that. "Sloppy. Or arrogant," I said. He met my eyes. "Both." We spent the rest of the morning assembling a timeline. Every document was sorted, labeled, and color-coded. Charles called in a friend, Paul, a retired estate litigator who still kept an office on the same floor. Paul had a tired face but a sharp mind. He glanced through the stack and said, "You might have something here. It's not open and shut, but if we can get a statement from the nurse or a medical evaluation from that period, the court might listen." I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear but a surge of clarity. A sense that I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was moving forward. After the meeting, I drove straight to the hospice center. The woman at the front desk remembered me. "You were Mr. Layton's daughter, right?" "Yes." I was wondering if I could speak to Nurse Claire. She was with him most often. The receptionist hesitated. "She's not scheduled today. Is there any way I could leave a message? It's important. Personal, not legal." I scribbled a note and left my number. Then I sat in my car for 10 minutes just breathing. Across town, I knew Margaret was probably sitting in my father's office at the vineyard, talking to vendors like she owned the land. Travis was likely bragging to his friends about the money he had coming. And Lorraine was probably already putting the Vermont house on Airbnb. They thought I was finished. That I had no power. That I'd take the blow and disappear. But I had just walked into the one office they didn't control. And now I had a team. They stole my inheritance. But I was going to take back everything, calmly, legally, and piece by piece. And when it was over, they wouldn't even see the strike coming. They'd just feel the collapse. Nurse Claire called me back 2 days later. Her voice was gentle, careful, like someone who had dealt with grief in many forms and didn't want to cause more. She remembered me right away. "Of course I remember you, Olivia," she said. "You were with him almost every night toward the end." I swallowed the knot in my throat. I was wondering if we could talk in person. "There's something I need to ask about my father's final weeks. It's important." She hesitated for only a second. "All right. I'm off tomorrow afternoon. Do you want to meet at the hospice center or somewhere else?" We met at a quiet cafe near the edge of town. She wore her scrubs even though she wasn't working, her hair pulled into a low bun, a pair of reading glasses resting on her head. She looked like someone who had nothing to hide. We sat in a back booth. I brought the folder. She brought her memory. "I won't ask you to say anything you're uncomfortable with," I began, placing the folder between us but not opening it yet. "I just want the truth. Because something about what happened doesn't make sense." She nodded slowly, already understanding. "I saw the new will," I said. "I saw when it was signed. And I saw who witnessed it." Claire folded her hands. "That was a strange day." I looked up. She continued. 3 people showed up around noon. One was a lawyer, Harold, I think. The other 2 said they were family friends. But I'd never seen them before. They stayed for less than 15 minutes. Was my father coherent? She didn't answer right away. "Claire." She exhaled carefully. "No. He wasn't. He hadn't been for days by that point. The dosage of his meds had been increased after a rough night, and that morning he could barely keep his eyes open. When they tried to speak with him, he nodded once or twice but he didn't say anything." "Not really. Did he sign anything?" Claire frowned. "That's the thing. I left the room for only 5 minutes to give them privacy. When I came back, the lawyer was already putting papers away. They said everything was handled." I leaned forward. "You're sure he couldn't have understood what he was signing?" She shook her head. "He didn't have the strength to write his name, Olivia. I had to help him hold a spoon the day before. There it was." I pulled out my recorder and placed it on the table. "Would you be willing to say that on the record?" I asked. "Just for my legal team. You don't have to testify. But if you could make a statement." She hesitated again, biting her lip. Then she nodded. "If it helps get to the truth, yes." We recorded her testimony right there. Name, date, medical license, and a clear statement about my father's condition on the day the revised will was allegedly signed. When I got home, I emailed the audio file to Charles. He responded within the hour. "This changes everything." That night I didn't sleep. Not out of anxiety, but because my mind wouldn't stop. This wasn't just about getting back what was mine anymore. This was about what they did to my father. They used his body, his name, his signature. They exploited a man who couldn't speak to protect himself. It wasn't just greed. It was desecration. And now, with Claire's statement, We had the first nail in the coffin of their entire case. The paper trail was crumbling. The timeline was breaking apart. They had built their empire on a dying man's silence. But I was about to give him his voice back. Charles wasted no time. The moment he received the recording from Nurse Claire, he forwarded it to Paul, the estate litigator we were working with. Within 24 hours, Paul had filed a preliminary petition to contest the will in probate court, citing concerns regarding testamentary capacity, undue influence, and possible fraud. It was the first real move, a formal declaration that we were challenging the validity of the revised will. I knew this would get back to my aunt fast. What I didn't expect was how quickly she would respond. The following afternoon, I received a letter delivered by courier. Thick paper, gold-embossed header. Margaret Layton. No signature, just a typed note. Olivia. I'm disappointed that you've chosen this path. I had hoped we could move forward as a family. If you continue down this road, you'll only humiliate yourself. There is no case here. Please reconsider. This is your last chance to avoid unnecessary hardship. Emil. I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands perfectly still. She wasn't scared. Not yet. This was arrogance. This was a woman used to getting her way, used to people backing down when threatened with pressure, guilt, or shame. But I wasn't the same person I had been at that will reading. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into a file labeled Intimidation Attempts. Let them pile up. The next day, the court acknowledged the petition. A hearing was scheduled, preliminary, just to determine if our case warranted further investigation. Paul would be representing me in court, but he insisted I be present. You need to look them in the eye, he said. This is as much psychological as it is legal. Meanwhile, our team kept working. Jenna, the forensic accountant, uncovered a chain of suspicious financial transactions. Estate funds wired to third-party accounts connected to shell companies. One of the accounts was registered under a business name that matched a company Travis had quietly launched just 3 months earlier. It was subtle but not subtle enough. The transfers were small at first, as if testing the system. Then larger ones followed. We traced over $480,000 siphoned in less than 6 months. Jenna pulled up screen captures, payment confirmations, and tax record discrepancies. She was methodical, exact. When she finished presenting it all to me, she leaned back and said, "They thought no one was watching." "They always do," I replied. At the same time, Lyle, our digital investigator, worked to verify the timeline of the will's signing. He analyzed metadata in the scanned PDF of the document submitted to court and cross-referenced it with public surveillance footage from the hospice building. There was. The day the will was supposedly signed, October 19th, was the same day Travis posted a photo on social media at a football game in another state. He had tagged himself and the 2 supposed witnesses to the will. The timestamp was clear. The location was verifiable. They weren't even in the city. We had proof of fraud. Now we just had to time it right. Paul advised we withhold the strongest pieces until the actual hearing. Let them come in smug and overconfident. Let them speak freely. Let them claim everything is in order. And then drop the truth like a hammer. I prepared myself for that day. I spent nights reviewing the files, going over every statement and note. I stopped taking calls from extended relatives. My phone rang constantly, some sympathetic, others trying to play mediator. But I didn't answer. They hadn't stood up for me when I was erased. They didn't get to ask questions now. I was focused. They stole my inheritance. They forged a man's final signature. They underestimated the one person who knew him best. And now I had the truth. I wasn't just going to take back what was mine. I was going to make sure they lost everything they built on the foundation of a lie. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I arrived early. The courthouse was quiet at that hour, the halls still echoing from the night before. I wore a simple navy suit, hair pinned back, no makeup except for a soft layer of powder. I didn't need dramatics. I needed presence. Paul met me at the front steps. He looked over his glasses at me and gave a short nod. "You ready?" I nodded. More than ever. The hearing wasn't to resolve everything, just to determine if our case would proceed. But this was the moment that would change everything. If the judge found the evidence compelling, the case would move into discovery. Depositions. Subpoenas. A trial. If he dismissed it, they would win. We walked into the courtroom. My Aunt Margaret was already seated, flanked by two attorneys in sleek, dark suits. Travis and Blake sat behind her, whispering and laughing quietly like they were at a brunch table. Margaret didn't even look at me. I took my seat at the petitioner's table beside Paul. The judge entered, an older man with a lined face and sharp, clear eyes. He didn't waste time. "Let's proceed." Paul stood. His voice was calm but carried across the room with quiet power. "Your Honor, we are here today because there is serious reason to believe that the last will of William Layton was not created under lawful or ethical conditions. We have evidence of mental incapacity, fraudulent witnessing, and financial manipulation surrounding the estate." He then presented Nurse Claire's sworn statement. Word for word, she described my father's condition on the day the will was allegedly signed. "He couldn't hold a spoon," Paul read. "He wasn't able to speak clearly. He was not in any condition to understand or authorize a document of legal significance." Margaret's lawyer immediately objected, claiming hearsay and irrelevance. The judge leaned forward. "You'll have your turn." Next, Paul submitted the social media evidence. Travis and both supposed witnesses tagged at a football stadium in a different state at the exact time of the will's notarization. "Hard to witness a legal document," Paul said, "when you're 300 miles away." The courtroom was silent. Then Paul brought out the financial records. Not all of them, just enough. A few carefully selected transfers from the estate account to shell companies. Small amounts. Just enough to raise eyebrows. The opposing attorney scrambled to respond. He claimed the will had already been certified, that the medical note from the original filing stated my father was lucid and in sound mind. Paul countered with a copy of the note, pointing out it was dated 5 days before the will signing, and that the doctor listed had never met with my father after that date. "And the notary?" the judge asked, raising an eyebrow. Paul slid a final page forward. "She was hired by Margaret's son for a single visit. Her commission expired a month later. She has since moved and cannot be reached." That was the moment I finally looked up and met my aunt's eyes. Her smile had faded. He knew. The judge tapped his pen against the folder. "There's enough here to move forward. This court finds sufficient grounds to investigate the legitimacy of the last will and testament of William Layton. Discovery is granted. A full hearing will be scheduled." Margaret stood immediately. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Travis looked stunned. Blake leaned forward, his jaw clenched. Paul and I stood. He whispered, "This is the beginning." As we walked past them, Margaret spoke quietly, sharp enough for only me to hear. "You don't know what you're starting." I stopped. I turned to face her, calm and steady. "No. You don't know what you finished." And I walked out knowing the storm had just begun. But for the first time they would be the ones standing in the wind. The days following the hearing felt different. The pressure that had been sitting on my chest for weeks had shifted, not gone but redirected. Now it pressed on them. Discovery began immediately. Paul submitted formal requests for internal estate documents, communication logs, financial statements, and anything tied to the updated will. Margaret's team fought every step of the way, delaying responses, redacting pages, claiming lost records. But Paul was relentless. Meanwhile, Jenna and Lyle worked quietly in the background, expanding our timeline and filling in every gap. Jenna followed the money. What she found painted a full picture. Consistent withdrawals, wire transfers to LLCs in 3 different states, and hundreds of thousands rerouted from the estate account, many of them shortly after my father's death. Lyle, on the other hand, dug into Travis. That's where the cracks widened. Travis had set up 2 of the LLCs under pseudonyms but registered them using his actual phone number. His digital trail was sloppy. He had emailed invoices to himself from fake vendor names and used those invoices to justify the withdrawals. We built the map. We printed it. And then we built a second one, showing how all 3 witnesses listed on the will had financial connections to Margaret's other businesses. One of them was her interior designer. Another was a cousin of her former assistant. The entire thing was a stage play. A performance for paper. But the most damning blow came from someone unexpected. It was an email, anonymous, sent to Paul's office with 1 attachment and a single sentence. She practiced the signature herself. I saw it. The attachment was a photo. Margaret at the kitchen table, pen in hand, a copy of my father's signature beside her. It had a timestamp, GPS metadata and background details that left no doubt it was taken in the estate house during the week the will was supposedly signed. Lyle ran a forensic match on the signature from the will and the copy in the photo. They aligned. Not identically, but close enough to raise suspicion. We didn't know who sent the email. Maybe a former housekeeper. Maybe someone inside her circle who had finally had enough. But it didn't matter. It was the crack in the armor. That week, Paul scheduled a deposition with Travis. Margaret tried to block it, but the judge had already ruled in our favor. Travis showed up cocky at first, slouching in the chair, answering in one-syllable shrugs. But Paul was patient. He asked him to recall the date of the will signing. Travis hesitated. October 19th, he guessed. Paul nodded. And where were you that day? Travis blinked. At the estate house. Paul pulled out a printed copy of the Instagram post. Travis, grinning at the football game, tagged in another state. Interesting, Paul said. So this photo is a lie? Travis's expression faltered. We also subpoenaed your travel records, Paul continued. You purchased a flight 2 days prior and didn't return until the 21st. Which means you couldn't have witnessed anything, could you? Travis didn't answer. Paul leaned forward. That's perjury. And if this will is proven fraudulent, you're not just looking at a reversal. You're looking at criminal charges. The room went dead silent. Later that evening, Paul called me. He's panicking, he said. They're going to try to settle. And they did. 3 days later, Margaret's attorneys submitted an offer. Partial return of the estate assets, non-disclosure agreement, no admittance of wrongdoing. We rejected it. Then came the second offer. More money, full control of the vineyard, but still under the condition that I remain silent. We rejected that too. As I wasn't just after what they took. I wanted a record. A decision. I wanted the truth spoken aloud, under oath, in a courtroom. I wanted everyone to see what they had done. Not just to me but to my father. They gambled everything on me being the quiet one. But they never understood. I wasn't quiet because I was weak. I was quiet because I was planning. The final hearing was scheduled on a Tuesday. Early spring. The air was crisp, clean, and unnervingly still, like the world itself was waiting to exhale. I arrived at the courthouse just after 8:30 a.m., walking past reporters who had started to gather at the steps. Word had spread. It wasn't every day that a prominent family estate was dragged into public dispute, especially one with deep ties to the region's history and economy. I kept walking. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to finish what they started. Inside, Paul was already waiting. Calm as ever. Charles sat quietly behind us, arms crossed, face unreadable. My allies. My anchors. Margaret walked in 5 minutes later with her legal team, Travis and Blake trailing behind her. She was dressed in all gray, as if mourning a version of herself she knew was about to die. Her expression was flat, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her. She wasn't in control anymore. The judge entered. The gallery quieted. And it began. Paul opened with facts. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the timeline, piece by piece, like bricks being placed for a foundation. Claire's statement confirming my father's mental incapacity. Jenna's breakdown of the financial theft. Lyle's data showing falsified witness locations and forged signatures. The anonymous photo of Margaret practicing his handwriting. When Travis was called to testify again, he folded within minutes. His answers were shorter than before. He stammered. He contradicted himself. At one point, his own attorney had to stop him from admitting he hadn't really looked at the will that closely. Margaret never took the stand. Her lawyers knew better. Instead, they attempted one last maneuver, claiming administrative error, suggesting the will was rushed but valid in intention. It was a final grasp at legitimacy. But Paul didn't let it land. He closed our argument with the only sentence that mattered. What they signed wasn't his will. It was theirs. The judge recessed for less than an hour. When he returned, he didn't waste time. He declared the revised will legally invalid due to proven fraud, undue influence, and lack of mental capacity at the time of signing. The original will, my father's real will, was reinstated. Everything was returned to me. The vineyard. The estate. The trust. All of it. But it didn't stop there. An investigation was opened into Margaret's financial misconduct. Civil fraud charges were to be pursued separately. Travis and Blake would be required to return misappropriated funds or face legal penalties. And all parties were barred from attempting to contact me again directly or indirectly. It was over. They had taken everything from me, thinking I would quietly disappear. Instead, I had taken it all back, with interest, with proof, with witnesses. As I stepped out of the courtroom, I felt the sun hit my face. I didn't cry. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't look back. That night, I walked the vineyard alone. The same one I had run through as a child, holding my father's hand. The same soil he had built his life on. The same land they tried to erase me from. I stood near the old shed, watching the wind ripple through the rows of green, and whispered, "I kept my promise." And in the stillness I imagined he heard me.